Good afternoon. Our keynote speaker will be Professor Arad. Arad is a professor of government at IDC's Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy, and chair of the Grand Strategy Forum and the Center for Defense Studies. Professor Arad served as National Security Advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and head of the Israeli National Security Council from 2009 to 2011. During Netanyahu's first term as Prime Minister, he was his foreign policy advisor, and all that was after a very distinguished career in the Mossad.
That's your edition.
That's my edition.
Yes.
It's boring to read it.
Okay.
In the Mossad, and I know that from first hand, where he held senior positions. At IDC, and that is where his academic career restarted, because he began as an academician. Arad founded the Institute for Policy and Strategy and launched and presided over its annual, I would add, prestigious Herzliya conference series.
But it started in the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv.
I said that. It was the beginning.
There are different narratives today about everything in history.
We know
Yeah.
the right.
I have at least three.
And I can add from personal knowledge that the subject that we are talking about, and that is nuclear strategy, is one of your favorites from early age, from your beginning at the Hudson Institute at the United States. So I am happy that we can help you talk about your favorite subject. Please.
Thank you very much, Lomo, and good afternoon to you all. It's not my favorite subject. It is just a thing.
One of.
It is one of the least pleasing subjects and the most difficult one by far, and very tormenting. But I was introduced by one of my best friends, and thank you for that, Shlomo, because yes, we do go a long way together, and I don't know if I can tell people how I convinced you to work in a certain place. Can I? You know, I don't know. That would be the first. Can I tell a story? Okay. I was recruited to work for the Mossad by a letter. I was told in the year 1974 to present myself in the Israeli embassy. I went to the Israeli embassy in Washington, and there awaited for me a letter written on a kind of a paper in which the typewriter made holes, you know. Remember those things? And in there, over a page and a half, it simply said, "We want you." And it was written by Yitzhak Oron, a man of tremendous integrity and of the old school, of course anonymous. And he did the job. You know, I didn't negotiate, I didn't argue, although I had many other offers. I said immediately yes. Okay. About almost 20 years later, I have a need to approach a certain Shlomo Brom and convince him to come to work with us. But he happens to serve in a very far country, which cannot be told. So, and we cannot do it on the phone. So how can I convince him to come and work for us? So I said, gee, there is that letter. It worked for me. Let's try it again. So I took that old letter from my file, just changed the names, and sent it via diplomatic pouch to that southern country. And as a result of that, it worked. It worked a miracle. But I'll tell you what was good about the letter. The letter used the following phrase. We want you, when you make a decision to join us, you should approach it as if you're joining a kibbutz or joining a monastic order. It's a different way of life. Think very seriously about it. Now, it said, we are not a group of angels. We are not. All human weaknesses and institutional weaknesses we have too. But we would like to think that we are a shmurat teva, a natural reserve. We're slightly better, at least in terms of motivation and national dedication. That worked for me. That worked for you then. Okay, so thanks again. And it is true that nuclear weapons have been on my professional agenda for more than I care to remember. It is a matter of age, simply a matter of age. Every person is a victim of his circumstances, his or hers, and you cannot shed that away. And when you mentioned the Hudson Institute, in a way, it's worse than that, because the formidable presence with whom I worked and traveled extensively was Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn, as you know, is one of the great strategic thinkers, but he was a very, I wouldn't say eccentric, but his style was different. He was often deliberately provocative. He was trying to think the unthinkable. He coined the term. He was very innovative in many things, and on many issues, his views on deterrence, to which we will come, was different. Just to recapitulate the time, in 1971, at that time, at Hudson, I worked simultaneously on two projects for the Department of Defense. And just think about it, how they were contradictory in their substance. One was following the ICBM treaty and the first SALT I, which was essentially, if you remember, it was hotly debated in America. The entire American Strategic Committee was divided between the proponents of forbidding missile defense and the supporters. The majority won, and we know what happened or what took place. But at the time, it was a debate with the ferocity and intensity among the experts that seldom you find. And I was working on the Hudson side, which, as I said, was critical of the ICBM treaty. And many of our friends already started to look, where could we cheat in the future? And even then, we knew that the cheating would be done in space. And many of those colleagues of mine ended up in the 80s with the Star Wars project and so forth. But back in 71, it was a serious issue. But at the same time, I was working on a project called Limited Strategic Options, which was designing cavalierly war plans for managing a nuclear war on German soil. So what does this indicate to you? It indicates that the one unlimited strategic options implied the failure of deterrence. In fact, it was work done on the assumption that war broke out. There were two contingencies of how this could happen. The problem was how not to escalate. My argument was, at the end of my work, that it would be impossible to contain that war. But it assumed a failure of deterrence. A failure today that people retroactively say, no, it was so stable at the time, the balance was so strong. This is all hindsight. In real time, those involved took very seriously the plausibility and possibility of a breakdown of deterrence. That was 1971. But then the same project, the other project, the ICBM, was how through arms control and through a very counterintuitive measure, self-exposure, not developing the missiles, freezing what you have and leaving yourself completely exposed, you would strengthen security and stability because it would, of course, deepen what was to be the balance or the MAD, which is a phrase coined at Hudson of assured destruction. So you cannot, you see at the same time, the same concept of deterrence being handled from both ways, different systems, different approaches, which indicated the profound anxiety of the time. A year later, coming to Israel, I was to witness the collapse of Israel's deterrent. Mind you, and I'm talking about conventional deterrence, mind you, 73 was not only an intelligence failure. It was a military debacle in so many ways, and it was the obvious failure of an ability to deter Syrians and Egyptians from attacking us, even on a limited scale, which is what we wanted. But essentially, not that it was much was built on it. After all, we relied on having early warning. What do you have early warning for? Something you think may happen, meaning we never fully trusted deterrence to suffice. But yet, we were deployed on the Suez Canal. In Cuneta, we were flushed with success 5, 6 years later, and yet those guys had the audacity, incredible, to synchronize a simultaneous surprise attack. What a glorious failure of whatever we had. Early warning, problematic. Deterrence, problematic. Performance on the battlefield, mixed. Certainly not decisive. Why am I saying all that? Among other reasons, because when we talk among ourselves, and many Israeli officials and so forth, they keep repeating ad nauseum something which I don't know where they take it from, that Israel's military doctrine and security concept is predicated on 3 things: warning, deterrence, and decisiveness. None of the above worked in 73. And I would still say that don't boast that all that much, because each one of them is a very tall order, and each one of them is very difficult to obtain. So to declare that as if it is self-evident, it is not, by the way. Ben-Gurion never said it. It is just repeated. Everybody repeats what somebody else says. So somebody made the original mistake, and then it is been. That's not the case. And besides, it is to say the obvious, as if to say that Israel's military doctrine is based on the Southern Command, Central Command, and Northern Command. In a way, true, but doesn't say much. But there you have it. You have Israel announcing, those who do, the centrality of the concept of deterrence. That one is repeated, which is the subject of this meeting, except it says nuclear. But deterrence is never only one thing, and that is my main argument. It's part of context, and it's part of other types of deterrence. So we do have the centrality of the concept of deterrence. We claim it is central to our doctrine. But when you examine what do we do or say about these, then you notice what would add up to a typical Israeli exceptionalism. And indeed, at one point, when I was talking to Itzik Ben Israel, colleague here, and I drew his attention that you say deterrence, but you mean something else. So Itzik, in his flamboyant way, said, well, to us Israelis, deterrence is something else. And in so doing, he took a liberty departing from what is sometimes a conceptual construct very much studied and understood worldwide. So you cannot really take liberties and call other things deterrence and avoid what it implies. But he did it. And in a way, he is right, because there are many exceptionalism to how it is used in Israel. I shouldn't blame, and one shouldn't blame anyone who has that kind of tendency to obfuscate and to have difficulties with the concept, because the concept is central not to Israel alone. It is a concept that has become the organizing strategic concept in the Cold War and in the first nuclear age. Whether we like it or not, there are good reasons for that. So about the strategic significance that it holds, there is no question. Everything revolved around it, whether explicitly or implicitly. But in the same breath, we have to say that this is by far the most difficult concept, the most elusive, the most complicated, in practice and in theory, compared to any other. So this is a tragic condition. the element of deterrence is central to the first nuclear age, but it is so difficult, it is under such attack, again, conceptual attack, academic attack, practical attack, difficult to get hold, and tremendous difficulties to put theory into practice. So one should have a great deal of empathy with those who deal with it and are really at the end of their wits what to do when they look at different aspects of it, and no wonder it's been challenged. If we could have done without it, I think many would be very pleased. The trouble is that the uniqueness of the nuclear age have created it and indispensable. And the answer is very simple. Deterrence is a defensive posture. It's not an offensive posture. It's an effort to make the other side not do to you something you don't want to be done to you. So it's defensive. Had we had good defenses against nuclear threats, then we would be falling back on defense. But the missile will always get through. You can shoot some. You can shoot them all. And the bombs will explode and do damage no matter what you do. So no real, I'm simplifying, of course there is at the margins, but no real defenses. So that immediately casts you into the next best posture, which is if I cannot defend and mitigate the consequences, and if we're talking about a catastrophic thing that could happen to me, I have to do all that one can to prevent even one single use. And to effect that, when you deal with nuclear weapons, sometimes the instrument it calls for is the same type. Not because of the elegance of doing it in kind, because you need that amount of thrust to effect that kind of restraint for the other side so as not to go under temptation to try and succeed. You have to make him calculate that even if he scores big, he'll regret his success tremendously. That's a very complicated, convoluted, psychological game. By the way, when you talk about compellence, is more difficult than deterrence because it's offensive. You compel someone to do something on with his. Here, defend, you try to prevent yourself, your territory, your population. But compellence is more rare, and seldom there is the use of compellence with nuclear instruments. Deterrence, the instruments were the object, and the instruments were the instruments. So, willy-nilly, it is technology and the logic of that technology, and the logic of the absence of technologies, for example, effective missile defense, that dictated a drift into that place. So it became central. And no matter how much questioning and how much discussion of the essential fragility of it, of all types, and you know all the literature, and on top of that, all the practical difficulties, no matter. There was no other alternative, unless you could develop. But that always was a function not only of politics, but of technology. But the irony, when it comes to Israel, is that you do not find in Israel any discussion of nuclear deterrence at all. At all. It gets the silent treatment. Why? Because, again, it's a derivative of the Israeli position of general ambiguity. Now, if you're ambiguous about capabilities of one kind or another, then you cannot effect a direct, formalized, codified policy of the classical mold. You cannot, and you will not. Therefore, no threats. And what is deterrence if not a threat? A leveraged threat, a credible threat, a threat that rests on reputation. But here, nada, no threats. With few exceptions, but they were not necessarily nuclear. So, again, as a derivative of a policy, the official, authorized, And on this business, only the authorities are authorized to spell out what the policy is, not interpreters, and not the eye of the beholders. And you cannot go and say, in their perception, well, that's a degraded form of deterrence. There is no deterrence policy which is authoritative and is authorized, not that we know it. It's not public. So for all practical purposes, I cannot talk about it, but it doesn't exist. It's silent. It's moot. What we have plenty of, perhaps too much of, is conventional deterrence. Suddenly, everybody became infatuated with the language of deterrence, so they brought this terminology, and everything that we did on a small scale became deterrence. Remember the reprisals that we had in the 50s? They put somebody, we sent Unit 101, we did a little thing. That was described by one strategic analyst as a policy of deterrence. That was no deterrence. That's a way to let off steam and to punish. Yes, to punish, but not to deter, because to deter, you have to calibrate the amount so as to bring about an end to it. Nobody thought about bringing an end to it. So here and there, you did see in Israeli management of its conventional warfare using elements, whether genuine or not, which come from the lexicon of deterrence. So the word reprisal, pulot tagmul, is one. But now, fighting other types of terrorists, we came to use the language of deterrence when we say, if they would do so much, they'll pay a price. So we put a price tag, we too. And we believe that the sheer volume of that and the price, that it would deter. And then you see Israeli commanders, you see Israeli generals, you see Israeli politicians talk all the time. Deterrence, it suffices, we are deterring the Hezbollah, we have to restore deterrence. All this is the language of deterrence, but you can never tell whether it is pure deterrence, because there are elements of war fighting of the most simplest type. Incursions is war fighting, is not deterrence. Deterrence in its purest form is what was referred here to, punishment, not denial. That's the purest form. And here, however, we do find also some instances in which there is use of punishment, and the most obvious example has been the decapitation of Hamas and others. In an effort to stem terrorist attacks, the idea was maybe we should target those responsible, make them think twice because they would be risking their lives when they go on something. And we had a policy of doing that, using aircraft, whatever. And the statistics show, by the way, that they did have an effect. But it did not have the kind of effect that nuclear weapons were supposed to prevent even one single use. Here, deterrence is not pure also in the sense that, frankly, we can take uses. Nothing would happen to the country if there would be more series of small-scale attacks in which we would have fatalities on the order of magnitude we're having anyway on the traffic. So there is no urgency and there is no absolute necessity to have an ironclad, effective deterrence for these kind of low-scale damage activities. So deterrence on the level of conventional warfare is seldom impure. It's always mixed. It's a hybrid between classical defense, some offensive limited offense, some possibility of some elements of punishment, but the intelligence that we needed for that is not the typical that you have for nuclear deterrence. And the practice of it was not the language. People talked about it. I think there's, again, I'm saying that ad nauseum because most people say about it as if it is something real. They say, look, Hezbollah are not firing on us. In fact, it shows. We are deterring them. I said, but we too, we're not firing at them. Does that mean that they are deterring us? Lack of some action. But then when the same person who said that, when we asked if we were to attack Iran, will they, the Hezbollah, fire? They are sure. So you don't have deterrence when you need it. You have it when you don't need it. So here you see the blurring of the concept. People use that too loosely, and although the subject is difficult, doesn't mean that you have to be so imprecise. In recent days, there is another usage of language of deterrence and the kind of punishment, but it is taken from another domain, which I want to enter now, and this is the cyber. You know, in the cyber lexicon, cyber deterrence, of course, is the mode of the day. Lots of examinations, real. We are entering a big debate like in the good old days. But usually, when you look at the spectrum of damage that cyber attacks can have, it usually goes like large-scale infrastructural catastrophic damage. You know, always there are those words. This is what presumably a large-scale, indeed, cyber attack can have. It doesn't kill people directly. It was never planned to do that. At best, it would have this infrastructural effect, which should be large-scale and therefore catastrophic. Now, look sometimes at the language that some Israeli ex-general have been using in trying to deter the Hezbollah from firing. They say, we'll bomb the hell out of the Lebanese and effect, quote, large-scale infrastructural damage. That is the language. So as to bring the Lebanese to put the squeeze on the Hezbollah. So this is indirect deterrence, threatening a very high cost to deter something, but using non-nuclear language. The only time that nuclear language was alluded to Israel was not by an Israeli, because I said Israelis are very quiet, very restrained, and don't dare say anything. But at the height of the 91 war, the first Gulf War, Vice President Cheney, he was Vice President, yeah, or Secretary of Defense. He was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer. And Wolf Blitzer asked him what would happen if the Iraqis would fire chemical missiles at Israel. It was in the middle of the war. It was a plausible question, to which Cheney said, Israel's response would be devastating. I woke up 2 hours later. I heard that he said that. I can't believe he said it. This is a language which is reserved for other things. He said it. It was on tape. He said it. I don't know what he meant. Nobody authorized him to say anything of the kind. But that's a language taken from another context. That language is not used. But let's come to cyber. What is the way how Israel is handling cyber? You would have thought that this is an area in which, again, we could very, very gallantly take, because we are self-declared cyber superpower, if you haven't heard. So now is the time for us to flex our muscles and feel more free by referring to possible deterrence, not because we want to flaunt it, but because to lessen the burden that it currently is elsewhere and is heavy. So sometimes substitution and diversification helps. And if there is this new instrument in which presumably we are good at, why not use it? And again, what is most interesting is on that this issue there is even greater silence. No serious authorized authoritative Israelis say one word about offensive strike capabilities with cyber, and not a word about deterrence. So we're left with deterrence being a concept used most extensively in the area to which it is least appropriate, conventional, and least necessary, and completely absent from the two areas in which you may need it. Now, there are very good reasons for that, you know very well, because when you look at the usefulness of cyber instruments, everybody notices the structural weakness of that in what is referred to as the attribution problem. Who do you threaten if you don't have high confidence into the source of the attack? And with that, an object for a threat, no deterrence. So again, that comes only from the logic of the technology. This goddamn technology is one in which it is relatively, and I remind you, relatively easy to conceal the source of attack, something which is very difficult, if not impossible, when it comes to nuclear. So it is that flaw of cyber which renders it not a useful instrument for direct deterrent threats. So in the very interesting debate that developed in America, still there is an examine, since Israel doesn't say anything about it, neither on nuclear nor on cyber, and since I think that the application to the conventional is so misconstrued, I would not depart from this Israeli habit and would not talk about it either. But I can certainly look at how Americans and others are talking about it, and the rest of my comments would be very much along the lines of the logic in the abstract of these instruments as they are discussed elsewhere within the strategic community or any other area. So there you come to cyber. Cyber, you have that initial flaw. But cyber is also not the ideal instrument because, as I said, there is no necessary need to use it in kind because most of the cyber attacks are not catastrophic. They are very disruptive. They can be strong harassment, but only at the very high level, mostly probably if affected by states, could you think about such degrees of damage that you have to use the full muscle to deter because you cannot afford to absorb it. So the urgency is not as high. The efficacy of the instrument in kind is not that high, but still there remains the possibility of very large-scale infrastructural damage, the catastrophic scenario. So you find a very interesting discussion in the West. If cyber cannot deliver the punch, would it be fair to use nuclear threats, nuclear deterrence, to deter cyber? Well, that could certainly concentrate the mind of any major country that would try to play havoc. Those countries should also know that when it comes to attribution, and with you look at the latest revelations about the collection ability of the NSA and so forth, it's not as easy and foregone a conclusion that it can be hidden. It's a probabilistic thing. And then the question is how risk-prone is a country betting and gambling that if it would launch a major attack, it would not be detected with some probability to justify retaliation. Who says you retaliate with 100%? In fact, the official doctrine of Western countries is not to say which is exactly the action for which they would use weapons. Sometimes they do say, but in many areas they say, we are ambiguous. That word is in the official British nuclear doctrine as the terms and conditions under which it might be used, other than those where it is automatic or bound by treaty and alliances. So it is enough if a country has to factor in a 50-50% that it would be caught in the action. Would it risk it? So therefore the attribution problem is slightly lessened and the need may still be there. But then upon reflection, everybody would say that it looks as if the nuclear thing is disproportionate, would always be disproportionate, even on a small scale, even if on a level commensurate with the damage caused by the cyber. But then there is also the norm, always the norm of doing something in kind. So either you develop a cyber deterrent to deter major cyber attacks, difficult, or you change your norms and use other instruments. But this is the bind in which most of the people working on this, and technology is evolving all the time, are concerned with. But there are other effects, mind you. Cyber is also changing the stability and survivability of nuclear systems, not only nuclear reactors. Think about nuclear systems. Very jokingly, but like all jokes, half seriously, somebody said, if you were an American and you had to place, an ICBM in a place which would be survivable and secure, whatever, and least vulnerable Where would you place it? In space, in the ocean, or on the land? Space is the worst of all places. The sea is no longer as quieting as it once was. So we back to the caves. It's land-based. Land-based, which would be, now, again, I told you it's half joke, but it's half serious to tell you that this development in the cyber world, in technology, is projecting on other deterrent situation and have to be therefore considered in their integrity. And you have to consider, because they affect one another defensively or offensively, because they provide you with some flexibility, you can move from one to another, but you have to look, therefore, when you talk about deterrence today, you have to talk about all types of deterrence, conventional as well, with all the variations. And I don't know how to call cyber, non-conventional, I don't know. But you put it, but it should all be looked at in a strategic context and very much driven by what could be the effects of it. I told you from the Israeli case, you cannot learn anything, but you can follow the debate and changes in American foreign policy. For example, from 2013 to this year, there's been a sharp increase in American official references to the need to develop a deterrent, the cyber deterrent, which shows that the debate, the pendulum is swinging in another direction. Let me close my commentary by 3 or 4 kind of observations about all other types of effects to consider, implications, and maybe things to do. The first is to do note that, you know, there was a debate here whether to talk about missile arms race or not. There is a technological race here going on, not among parties, but within ourselves. Technology. It is developing so fast and in so many areas that it is a scramble and it's not always controllable. So things change very rapidly and it has to be watched. The most interesting and funny, and I'm looking for the humorous part of things, that I read today in the paper. You know, the guys at CERN, this big nuclear facility in Switzerland where they have all those, you know, they got really upset about the NSA reading their mail. So they decided to put a group together to develop another kind of a wall, this time that would outsmart all those cryptographers and mathematicians. Now we have a glorious contest. Who will win? A concentrated body of self-serving interested physicists who are smart, bright, and are putting together, or the other side? There you have all the ingredients of a great, great contest among scientists. But that's only the tip, you know, of the iceberg. There's a great deal of race, and the race, the most obvious in this area, is also the thing that decided the nuclear. What is the relationship between the offense and the defense? Nuclear deterrence had to become by punishment because there were no defenses. But is it also true in the case of cyber? Cyber, the odds for defense are there, might be improved, never perfect. And if there would be such a case, then it would lessen the need for deterrence by punishment, which may be impossible, but increase the possibility here of an effective strategy of deterrence by denial, which would be, this time around, with a demonstrable ability to have robust and redundant and all those things about all these complicated things that would put an effective deterrent in the form of telling the enemy, you will attack, you stand a good chance of being exposed, and you would not do the harm that you intend to accomplish, and yet you'll be punished for that. So the option for a deterrence in the cyber in the form of denial is slightly greater, and that's why so many resources go into this, leaving aside the civilian. So much for this defense-offense relationship. Secondly, we are in for grand strategic debates. So tighten the seatbelts. We're entering a period of a few years of tremendous uncertainties, great debates among all concerned. That's the nature of the times. Third, however, secrecy would play here another role. There is one attribute of cyber weapons which is not shared by nuclear. The efficacy of a nuclear bomb remains even after it's used. One use of a certain cyber attack negates its usefulness for the future. So you have to, first, not to reveal its existence, not to reveal that you have defenses, not to use it, because once you use it, you're essentially doomed, and you wouldn't be able to repeat it, because the other party, if it has another round, would erect immediately a wall and protect itself. So it is a self-negating instrument, making a very high premium on secrecy and no use. So a country may have superb weapons but not use it in a context which to them is not critical. For example, not on Iran. Why waste, the ultimate, the latest in this area on such an object as Iran, which doesn't jeopardize national security interests? Let's keep that for the real game, the consideration. Now, if secrecy is such a matter of premium, and like the cavemen coming back to the fore, I can hail and say that intelligence is back, and which pleases me very much. But intelligence is not only back, but it is back in its original, raw, ancient type, human intelligence. Because it takes human sources to break through very sophisticated, not the code deciphering, but to penetrate. There is nothing like a human penetration of the enemy. And that, at the end of the day, may turn out to be the least expensive and more probable to succeed compared to the alternatives. So you would see more efforts at improving intelligence, not on cyber, which of course will happen, not on SIGINT, which of course happens, but on human, to complement all that and being the trump card. One comment about arms control. I think, I listened to the discussion here. Yes, inevitably, and now I'm speaking seriously, when all things are said and done, there is much room for a great deal of creative and re-energized instruments of arms control of all types. All that had been used in the past and been put aside maybe come again in order. CBMs of all kinds, but CBM in general, strategic thing, that is measures adopted, the same by both sides, not the other thing. But also the norms discussion, all this may be necessary. Code of conduct, rules of the road, all this. There is just as there is to be a flourishing of a scientific arms race and technological, there would be a flourishing of the creative diplomatic part of it, political part of it, to try to dampen, to cool the system, to slow it down. So there's plenty of that. Also, as was alluded, alliances formation, new alliances maybe, like-minded coalitions. There's much of that needed, and the allies need not be states. Could be, think about the politics of that, big corporations. Alliance between certain states and their big corporations makes all kind of odd bedfellows, but what it may take to share the burden. So there is a great deal of room for all kind of things to do. But if I have to sum it up and try in the most general sense what this adds up to in the kind of commentaries I want to finish with, the first would be, if all this is true, then prevention should be given as much chance as one can before you get to it. Prevention through all the means possible or necessary. Preventions through cost-effective means such as sanctions, economic sanctions. Prevention through other means. Before arrival to the stage in which you have nuclear deterrence to put your confidence in is not the thing you want to go to. So prevention remains the main road and should be on all areas, in all areas. Here technology is doing us much harm. Secondly, to celebrate the virtues of defense. Defense is back in vogue of all types. Defense, as much as you can shift to defense rather than the punitive side, the better. Technologically and otherwise. Defense also, if you can reduce those things to the conventional level as much as you can, avoid the cyber, although it can be low intensity, cool war is what some people called it. Conventional, try to de-escalate everything that can be done, everything. That's the direction. And finally, spread the risk, substitute. Do not put so much heavy burden on nuclear and on nuclear deterrence. That's a fragile construct. Do not rush into it. And it is inordinately expensive, and it is very, very risky. So that is something to avoid unless you're compelled to handle it. Then handle it with care and prudence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uzi. We have to prepare for the video conference, or we have no time for Q&A. So it's a short break?
Short break and 4 o'clock sharp.
Okay.
4 o'clock sharp, and let me add one other thing. When you come back, be on that half of the room. So where there's this divide in the middle, be on that half. Thank you.